Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. It is UFC 293 fight week. Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland for the middleweight title. And Israel Adesanya has been getting an unwarranted amount of hate during this fight week. And he gets a lot of hate from UFC fans in general. And we're going to discuss the real reason UFC fans hate Israel Adesanya. And we're also going to discuss why he doesn't get the respect that he deserves. And I think people are going to realize it when he's gone. And I'm going to discuss a couple topics in this video that's really going to piss a lot of people off that nobody else is ever willing to discuss. And we're also going to discuss, recently there's been a fan narrative fabricating false stories about Israel Adesanya to delegitimize him. And we're going to discuss that in this video as well. So we have a lot to talk about Israel Adesanya. But I've talked about this with many of fighters, how we don't appreciate them truly until they're gone. I recently talked about it with Alexander Volkanovski. I talked about it with Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje. You don't realize how fast these guys' career just disappear. It just disappear. They fall off a cliff. We've seen it time and time again. I'm sure there's a lot of longtime fans that know exactly what I'm talking about. But the problem is, when we're in that special moment of time, watching a special fighter, we don't appreciate it for what it is. You know, I look back, Anderson Silva, one of my favorite fighters of all time. We're going to talk about him in this video. But I didn't truly appreciate it and realize what a special moment in time we were in until, boom, he gets knocked out by Chris Weidman. And then he's never the same again. That was all the way back in 2013. And you think back, I can name countless examples. GSP, he beat Johnny Hendricks controversially. And at the post-fight, people acted like it was a foregone conclusion he would return and defend the welterweight championship. We thought we were getting a rematch against Johnny Hendricks. He only fought once since then, and he only came back years later to cherry-pick a title shot. So these fighters who are special in the sport, who live out these long title reigns, you don't realize it till they're gone. And even the people who hate Israel Adesanya, you are going to miss him when he's gone, because think about how much fun it is to root against him. You know, I'm not the biggest Israel Adesanya fan. I know some people think I am. But think about how boring it's going to be. You know, there's people always saying middleweight is trash. Imagine without Israel Adesanya what the middleweight division is going to look like. And I truly believe he doesn't get anywhere near the level of respect that he deserves, because I believe he's one of the UFC GOATs. And he's not even really thrown out in that conversation. He's right up there with GSP. He's right up there with Anderson Silva. He's right up there with John Jones. There's no doubt he's right in that conversation for middleweight GOAT. But I do believe he should be in the conversation of greatest of all time in the UFC in general. And the reason I love watching him fight is because he is one of the most high-level fighters I have ever seen. The striking is unbelievable. And I love watching the best versus the best. That's why Israel Adesanya is one of my favorite fighters to watch. That's why John Jones is one of my favorite fighters to watch. That's why GSP and Habib and Anderson Silva were some of my favorite fighters to watch, because they were super high level. And you look at Anderson Silva, and he had a great run in the UFC. And I still think there's an argument to be made for Anderson Silva versus Adesanya. And maybe Adesanya hasn't just eclipsed Anderson Silva just yet. But you look at Anderson Silva's overall career in the sport. He went 17-7 in the UFC with 10 title defenses. Currently right now, Israel Adesanya is 13-2 in the UFC with 5 title defenses. And he's a 2-time UFC middleweight champion. And I know that sounds like, oh, well, that's a shoo-in for Anderson Silva. But when you start looking at the level of competition, and I know you can always have this debate and it's super subjective, but you start looking at some of the title defenses, and you're looking at Damian Maia, you know, Patrick Cote, you know, you're looking at Chael Sonnen, not a bad title defense by any means. That's actually the fight that turned me into a hardcore fan back at UFC 117 when Anderson Silva lost the entire fight, only to win it in the 5th round. But you look at the level of opposition Anderson Silva fought. He fought decent opposition. But I feel like Israel Adesanya fought better opposition. You're looking at some of these names. He beat Anderson Silva, and I know Anderson Silva was on the decline at that point in time, so that doesn't mean a lot. But then you have Robert Whittaker ×2. Robert Whittaker, one of the best middleweights of all time. You have a win over Yoel Romero. I know it wasn't the most exciting, and we're going to talk about exciting performances in a minute. We're talking about an utter destruction of Paulo Costa. We're talking a domination of Marvin Vettori. We're talking beating Robert Whittaker again. We're talking beating Jared Cannonier. Then we're talking getting finished by Alex Pereira, his arch nemesis, only to rematch him and brutally KO him to get his title back. I think it is a resume that makes him one of the greatest middleweights of all time and one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. And also what people don't appreciate, and I talk about this all the time with different fighters, the number one thing that makes me a fan of a fighter is activity. You look at Israel Adesanya. He's scheduled to fight for the second time in 2023. He fought 3 times in 2022. He fought twice in 2021. He fought twice in 2020. He fought 3 times in 2019. He fought 4 times in 2018. Anderson Silva was very active as well, but I don't feel like he was as active as Israel Adesanya. And honestly, that doesn't matter a whole lot. But what I'm trying to say here is you have to take that into account. When we have champions just sitting on the sideline, I'm not saying that about Silva, but I'm saying we have champions who fight once a year. We have champions that fight every 8 months. And people always call them out. People, made fun of Francis Ngannou for getting iced by the UFC. And then, he never fights. He only fights once a year anyway. We have a guy like Adesanya fighting 2-3 times a year every single year. And we have to appreciate that, and we're going to miss it when it's gone. Because if we get another middleweight champion in the near future, I guarantee they're not as active as Israel Adesanya. So I really do believe that Adesanya is one of the greatest middleweights of all time. Now, there is a lot of reasons that UFC fans hate Israel Adesanya. And one of the main things I hear is, he's boring. He's a boring fighter. And I just think that's just inaccurate. I think that's an inaccurate generalization. Of course, has he had a couple boring fights? Yes, he has. But look at his fight against Kelvin Gastelum. That's one of the best middleweight title fights of all time. It's for an interim title. Great fight. I know the Yoel Romero fight wasn't that good. People have boring fights. The Paulo Costa fight, amazing. Went out there, systematically destroyed Paulo Costa. The Jan Blachowicz fight was fun to watch. He lost that fight, And there's another reason. He tried to go up and capture his second title. He lost to Jan Blachowicz. He went back down to middleweight and just continued to win. You look at the Marvin Vettori fight, not the greatest, but still a relatively entertaining fight. The Robert Whittaker's rematch, relatively entertaining fight. The Jared Cannonier fight wasn't that good at all. And then you have the 2 Alex Pereira fights, which were unbelievably exciting. And I've heard a lot of people excuse it away and say, well, the only reason those fights were exciting was because of Alex Pereira. Okay, well, do you excuse away his boring fights by saying, the only reason they were boring was because of the other fighter? So Adesanya's Yoel Romero fight was only boring because of Yoel Romero. No, it's on both fighters to make a fight exciting. So I just think that criticism is a little bit unwarranted. I do understand there's a grain of truth to it, but at the same time, it's just, I just feel like to generalize Adesanya's career as boring is completely ridiculous and unwarranted. Then you have people who say, he's cringy, he's corny. That is true, 100% true. 100% true. Adesanya is cringy and corny. But what I just find so interesting about this narrative, and again, it's 100% true, you have these same type of fans who worship Sean Strickland, who worship Colby Covington, who worship fighters who are also corny and cringy. For me, I stay consistent. I think Adesanya is corny and cringy, but he's being himself. I think Sean Strickland's corny and cringy. I think he puts on a little bit of an act. And then you have Colby, who's corny and cringy, who puts on a complete act. And maybe you say, well, the reason I like these fighters is because, at least it's an act. But I just find it so weird when you have the same version of fighters, they still act the same way. I know it's not exactly the same way, but you can still define them as cringy and corny. Yet you cheerlead these certain fighters, but you don't like this guy because he makes weird lines about Elsa. Well, at least you have something to talk about. But again, this is warranted, and this is another reason why UFC fans hate Israel Adesanya. Another thing we continue to hear, and I just wanted to talk about this in the video. This really doesn't have to do with, a reason why fans hate Israel Adesanya. But I hear people say middleweight is garbage. And this is a way of delegitimizing Israel Adesanya because this has been a common trope for many years with dominant champions. And I know people are going to say, he's not necessarily dominant because he lost to Pereira. He's a dominant champion. And in a way, and I know factually this isn't actually 100% true, he is a long-reigning champion in a way. He lost his belt. He got it right back. But we're splitting hairs there. It doesn't matter. Either way, we've heard so many times that middleweight is garbage. When you have a dominant champion, the division always looks worse than it actually is. This happened with GSP. This happened with middleweight under Anderson Silva. It's just a common trope. When you have a really good champion, people just delegitimize the division. And I don't think middleweight's, I don't think it's a bantamweight division. I don't think it's a lightweight division. I think middleweight isn't, nowhere near the greatest division in the UFC, at least not the greatest men's division in the UFC. But I still feel like people are a little bit over-exaggerating on how bad middleweight is. And on top of that, another thing, there's so many things that I can go through that I hear every single day on a consistent basis when Israel Adesanya is scheduled to fight. I hear people bring up the gyno. I hear people keep saying, Israel Adesanya is on PEDs. He's on PEDs. We saw the tit. He had a boob. He had gyno. He's definitely on PEDs. You literally have internet trolls diagnosing a fighter of PED use based on Instagram pictures. That's what you have. That is no solid evidence by any means. May he be on PEDs? Sure, he might. But you don't have legitimate evidence to support that claim. Meanwhile, and I hate to keep making these comparisons, but you'll get what I'm getting to in a minute, you have Sean O'Malley, who has failed a test before. Nobody ever brings that up. You have Conor McGregor, who has openly admitted to leaving the USADA testing pool so he can abuse PEDs. That is literally, he has openly admit that on Twitter. And there's no criticism. There's no criticism. But because Israel Adesanya keeps winning, and because one time his pectoral muscle looked a little bit weird and then disappeared afterwards, oh, he must be on PEDs. There couldn't be a million other medical reasons why that exists. People are acting like all of a sudden they're medical experts based on gyno. You hear that all the time, and all of it is to delegitimize a dominant champion. You also have the argument, 1-3, Alex Pereira, 1-3. That's just factually inaccurate. We're discussing MMA. We're not discussing his kickboxing matches from literally like 6 years ago have nothing to do with the GOAT conversation or Israel Adesanya's overall resume discussion in 2022 or 2023 or any year in MMA. It is a totally different sport. I don't care if Pereira beat him in ping pong 6 years ago. It's irrelevant. And then you have the 2 fights against Alex Pereira, which I think strengthened the resume for Israel Adesanya. The first fight was winning pretty clearly, gets finished in the 5th round. The second fight, he comes back, brutally KOs Alex Pereira. And even if, as devil's advocate, you want to include those kickboxing matches, if you take all the time that Adesanya and Pereira have spent in either the cage or the ring, and you count down every second you feel like Adesanya's winning, I would say Adesanya won, 85% of all 4 of those combat sports contests between the two. So I just think that's just another thing that people just completely blow out of proportion. Those 2 kickboxing matches from years ago are literally irrelevant, and it's just another way to delegitimize Israel Adesanya. Now, another thing that people do, and this is something that people are going to cry about in the comments. I already know this. I've talked about it in one other video before, and people still bring it up to this day, and that is racism in MMA, okay? People say it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There's no way anybody hates Israel Adesanya because of his race, and that is just untrue. And while we don't have any scientific evidence or we don't have any way to really quantify it, it does exist in MMA. It 100% exists in MMA. There is people that hate Israel Adesanya based on his race. Now, there's a bunch of other reasons as well, which I've already mentioned, which some of them are legitimate, some of them I disagree with, but some people still believe. But racism exists in MMA. And there's so many people that I've heard say, well, if racism exists in MMA, it exists based on every race. So there's Brazilians hating on this race. There's black people hating on white people. There's this is the excuse. This is the defense, okay? But my defense to that is the MMA fan base, the UFC fan base is predominantly white. There was a study done in 2010. It said that 60% of the UFC fan base is white. So even if you take every race spread out across the UFC of fandom and you say just 1% of those is racist, okay? Just 1%. That means at a much higher rate that white fans are racist towards black fans or any other minority in terms of the fan base, because you have 40% left and it's spread out over all these different races. And I'm not saying that this is the major factor at all. That's not what I'm saying. Some people are going to take it the wrong way and say, oh, he said only people dislike Israel Adesanya because they're racist. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just acknowledging its existence because it does exist, and I see it on a regular basis on Twitter, on Instagram comments, in my YouTube live chat. I see it all the time. So it does exist. We're going to acknowledge that it exists because there's no one else brave enough to ever say that, because guess what? The portion of the MMA community that's racist is now going to be jumping down in the comments and saying, no, it doesn't exist. Let me just say this, and then we're going to move on to the next thing. If acknowledging racism exists in MMA amongst fans, if acknowledging its existence angers you, then you are most likely a racist. Unsubscribe to the channel. I don't want you here. I don't want you here. You don't pay my bills. I do not want you here. Unsubscribe. If you are angry about me making that claim that, it's based on anecdotal evidence, but in my opinion, it is 100% true. It's not even my opinion. It's a fact. It is a fact. It does exist. To what extent it exists, we can have that debate. Sure, we can have that debate, but it does exist. Another thing that I've seen time and time and time again, and I discussed this for maybe a minute in one of my previous videos a couple months ago, and I said, you know what, nobody ever talks about this either. There is a portion of the fan base who is homophobic and hate Israel Adesanya because they think he's bisexual or he's gay. And I see this so many times, calling Adesanya gay, calling him the gender bender, talking about his painted nails, talking about what he wears to press conferences. If you're worried about another grown man's sexual preferences, you are a weirdo. That 100% exists. I remember when I first thought about talking about this in a video, earlier this year, and I talked about it briefly in a video, I asked a few people, I said, what is one reason people dislike Israel Adesanya that nobody ever mentions? And from 5 different people, they responded, because they think he's gay. Because Adesanya has a unique personality and acts a certain way and paints his nails and wears certain weird clothing and wears a dog collar, all of a sudden, fans hate him because they think he's a homosexual, even though he's probably not. I don't know. I don't wonder about fighter sexuality. I have never sat here in this chair. I've never wondered about my life when I'm outside. I'm like, I wonder what that fighter's sexual preference is. I don't think about that. But you have a fan base that does think about that. And I don't know to what percentage, but you have a large fan base that's talking about Jeff Molina. Jeff Molina came out as bisexual or was exposed as being bisexual online against his will. You know how much of the MMA fan base thought that was so funny? Oh, it's hilarious. And you have other fighters co-signing it and saying, oh, Jeff Molina sucks and all this, and just constant jokes. And it is what it is. I'm not clutching my pearls over any of it. I'm just saying that it exists. And then you have people like Manel Kopp, who's actively been throwing out homophobic slurs online. And guess who's their new favorite fighter? It's Manel Kopp. That's just the truth of the matter. That is just the truth of the matter. And you won't see MMA media call it out. You won't see the UFC call it out. You won't see other MMA YouTubers call it out because they're scared of backlash. I'll get a lot of backlash for this video, but guess what? I don't care at all. I do not care. I'm going to speak my honest opinion. You can agree with it. You can disagree with it. We can have a debate. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to be scared into not mentioning certain things because of fear of fan backlash. And then, and this is one of the last things we're going to discuss in this video, you have a recent story that's been fabricated about Israel Adesanya and his dog. And I've seen all the evidence. It appears people have been tweeting at me nonstop because I say people are misrepresenting this. And essentially, without getting into too graphic detail about what people are saying, that's literally dishonest, people are implying that Israel Adesanya is on video having a physical interaction with his dog that is inappropriate. I don't want to get demonetized. I don't want to get into exactly what they're saying, but they're suggesting some disturbing stuff. And it's just factually inaccurate. I never searched this video. I never saw this video until yesterday. I saw the video. The video has been vastly misrepresented by almost the entirety of every person that has tweeted at me saying, no, he did this, he did this, he did that. And you had Sean Strickland bring it up at the press conference. It's just factually incorrect. What they are doing is they are taking a small moment in time that's on video, okay? They are misrepresenting it to delegitimize Israel Adesanya. They want to embarrass him. They want to delegitimize him, and they want to ruin his reputation by spreading a false narrative. It's been entirely fabricated. It is not true remotely. It is false. If you want to say what Israel Adesanya did in this video is very weird, sure, fine, I can agree with that. But what people are suggesting is going on in this video is just untrue, and it's vastly misrepresented to build a false narrative. And let me just say this for all the people who are going to disagree with me down in the comments. If you truly believe that Adesanya did what you said he did in this video, which is, again, completely false, why aren't you calling for him to be cut from the UFC? Why aren't you calling for UFC 293 to be canceled? He needs to be pulled off the card. If he did this, he needs to be pulled off the card. If he did this, he needs to be cut from the organization. And honestly, we need to file a police report. He needs to be investigated for criminality. And if there's criminality, he needs to be charged to the fullest extent of the law. So people saying I'm defending him, if what people are suggesting is accurate, okay, which it's not, I've already seen it. It's not accurate at all. We need to have him pulled from UFC 293. He needs to be cut and he needs to be charged criminally. But guess what? They will never suggest that because this entire argument is only to delegitimize Israel Adesanya. It is a bad faith argument only because they dislike Israel Adesanya. That's all it is. That's all it truly is. And it's just embarrassing. I can't imagine being an MMA fan and being so obsessed with different fighters. You have to make up a completely false narrative, including an animal, abuse of an animal, to delegitimize a fighter you don't like. That's incredibly bizarre. And what I find even more bizarre is these same people are Sean Strickland sycophants. They love Sean Strickland, who's admittedly previously a neo-Nazi, who's admittedly online said he's killed a dog. Where's the outrage for that? Where's the outrage for that? Think about all the disturbing things he said. Oh, women shouldn't work or vote. And everyone just excuses away. Oh, it's a joke. It's just a joke. Well, there's no outrage for that. And it's just ridiculous. And these people who hate Israel Adesanya for this false narrative are the same people who just love Sean Strickland. And let me break down what happens at UFC 293 if Sean Strickland wins. Because if Sean Strickland wins, these same people are going to cheerlead Sean Strickland. And I've heard people say, oh, I hope Strickland throws the N-word back at Adesanya. These same people were wishing that Strickland would use the N-word. These same people are cheerleading Sean Strickland to become more unhinged and use this unique personality of his to say ridiculous things. That's what they are doing. And if Sean Strickland wins, they're going to continue to cheerlead him. It doesn't matter what he does. It doesn't matter what he's caught on video doing. They will continue to endorse Sean Strickland and promote him and love him as a fan. And what I find funny about that is that these same people call Israel Adesanya boring. Sean Strickland, how many exciting fights has he had? And I don't necessarily find Strickland boring. That's not necessarily what I think. But I'm just saying in comparison, objectively, Adesanya far more exciting than Sean Strickland. But also, if Adesanya wins this fight and has any trouble, if it's a close fight by any means, if it's even competitive, it doesn't matter if Adesanya wins 4-1. If it's even remotely competitive, the slander of Adesanya will continue. And the reason I wanted to discuss this is because there's so many different ways Adesanya's career can go from here. Let's say he beats Sean Strickland. I think people will slander him if he has even a remotely competitive fight. But let's say he beats Sean Strickland. Let's say he KOs him in the first round, Alex Pereira style. It's not even competitive. People will say, oh, well, that was an easy fight for Adesanya. He got an easy matchup in Sean Strickland. And then let's say Adesanya says, you know what? I'm retiring. You know what the narrative will be then? He's ducking Dricus du Plessis. He's ducking Khamzat Chimaev. It doesn't matter what Adesanya does. These people are just obsessed with hating him. A large portion of the fan base is obsessed with hating him. And that's your right. Fair enough. But they will continue to misrepresent narratives all with a sole purpose of delegitimizing him. Because I guarantee, even if he went out there in his next fight and beats Dricus du Plessis, and he retires, people are going to say he's ducking Khamzat. If he goes out there and beats du Plessis and then beats Khamzat and moves to light heavyweight, they'll say, oh, he's ducking the next contenders at middleweight. If he goes up to light heavyweight and loses to Alex Pereira, they'll say, see, Alex Pereira was always the better man. And I just think people fail to realize we are in a special moment in time watching a very special career that doesn't come along that often. And it'll be gone before you know it. He could get KO'd against Sean Strickland on Saturday and never be the same again. And I know some people want that. He could suffer an injury on Saturday, never be the same again. And I know some people want that. But for me, I really enjoy watching him fight because he is one of the greatest of all time, regardless of what I think about him personally. And I feel like people are missing that point. And even the people that hate him will realize once he's gone how much fun it was having Israel Adesanya as a middleweight champion. And I just think the amount of hate that he gets is completely unwarranted. Don't get me wrong. There are some legitimate reasons to dislike him. But the level of hate that has fans pushing false narratives about Israel Adesanya and his dog are completely ridiculous. And I just really believe we have to take into account that Israel Adesanya is one of the greatest middleweight champions of all time and one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. And I, for one, will be sad when he's gone. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.